Varnaxis. Approximately 250 billion human souls, if the administratum's count could be trusted, called this world as their home. To be more accurate, they called the capital hive city of Damaris as their home, as in fact the wider planet had been reduced to little more than an arid wasteland left to languish in polluted abandonment, while the city grew and grew. There used to be smaller outposts scattered across its surface, but that was long ago, and over the passing millennia, the importance of the central hive only became more apparent. And to participate in the imperial society, you could either contribute to the city or be forgotten beneath its shadow. The planet itself, previously known as Verandum, was never all that impressive. It was just one of the countless worlds which humanity settled during its ancient past. But of course, once it became a part of the Imperium, it found itself burdened with a resoundingly new purpose. Situated in the southern reaches of Segmentum Pacificus, it hardly needed to be a fortress, and its soils were unsuitable for agri-work. But where it lacked in raw resources, it certainly held enough space to support a prodigious population. Thus, the hives were brought up, rising tall across the sprawling landscapes, towering up through the emergent clouds of smog, until it stood as perhaps the only notable landmark on this truly unremarkable world. The citizens here, partly consisting of the descendants of the original settlers and of the many Imperials shuttled in from distant worlds, were mostly ignorant to the grim darkness of the wider galaxy. Pacificus was always a peaceful segmentum, and so it seems rather merciful that the darkest days of its denizens only really relate to their daily labors, as opposed to fending off some chaotic invasion. But these labors were always in service to one thing: the tithe. In brief, the tithe is a form of taxation, where every world in the Imperium will be graded and ordered to submit some quantity of resources and troops so as to serve the interests of all mankind. In the case of Varnaxis, they were expected to deliver a sum of raw goods, a quota of manufactured equipment, and a meagre fraction of their conscripts, who would go on to be drafted into the distant regiments of the Imperial Guard. But to be quite honest with you, everything upon this world was fine. The populace was remarkably normal, and despite the bureaucratic order often feeling rather impersonal, every citizen knew that they were but one tooth of a great cog, which endlessly turned to fuel the rusting colossus of the Imperium of Man. Their lives, however, could not be entirely separate from this vast machine. They all knew that they got by, but by how much? The workers had no idea at how razor-thin their margins were. But they didn't have to. They were effectively tools, working on something much larger than themselves. The clerks and the bureaucrats thought they knew, but realistically, they were themselves lost in the administrative passings of a supervisory life. The soldiers of the Guard didn't need to know. They only trained and honed their skills, maintaining their sense of honor, disdainfully looking down upon the workers who never appreciated their vigil. The clergy didn't care. Their responsibility was to guide the spiritual essence of the hive, for a good worker is a faithful worker, and they needn't waste their sacred efforts on that which seemed so beneath them. But the lords knew. The planetary governor and his noble aides, they all knew the truth. They knew that the world was teetering on the edge of matching the tithe, that their tolerances were painfully tight. Yet they also did not care. They had always guided the hive, and always would. So why bother fussing over details, especially when there is a feast to be had and a coffer to raid? But upon such a world, where voices and peoples are so often aggregated into crude generalities, perhaps it would be prudent for us to zoom in and to learn of how the varied classes truly felt about their life upon Varnaxis. The workers, clerks, soldiers, clergy and nobles all had their part to play, and all knew their collective pulse kept the planet turning. But of all those billions, none really knew of how delicate their society truly was, and of how easily something so safe and so stable could be tipped off balance and sent hurtling into an age of strife. The hive thrummed with activity. This gargantuan metropolis of Gothic spires, jutting tall above buttressed walkways to conceal a million intricate habs, had not been built to house the billions of humans free of charge. To live upon this world was to work, with the vast majority of the citizenry being tasked with taking up their posts within the innumerable manufactoria, which, while less impressive than of those on a forge world, were still adequate for producing the varied goods of the Imperium. They produced most everything they could, with industrial self-sufficiency rates hovering around a respectable 62%. But this level could only be achieved thanks to the constant efforts of the common worker. Their days within the hive were mostly bereft of natural light, and so, free from their circadian naturalities, time was only to be measured and acknowledged by alarm klaxons, screeching out with relentless regularity, signaling for the mass change of a shift. They were the lowest class of this world, consisting of menial labourers, machine tenders, and industrial plebs, who each performed their monotonous duties to transform raw materials into the Imperium's necessities. It was rare to find a worker with any variety to their craft, each typically repeating but a single motion for tens of thousands of times a day, under the dim lumiglobes of the factorum. However backbreaking it felt, it was at least honest work. Many took a quiet pride in their skill, with the veteran assembly workers finding comfort in the thought that their own decades of experience had granted them with a deft touch that no automaton could replicate. Over steaming recaf mugs, the workers would swap their humble stories of outperforming their quotas, or of fixing a jammed gear on their assembly line, which doubtless made them feel indispensable in an existence otherwise devoid of distinction. Yet none of them felt so confident in their abilities that fear did not creep around the edges. Over the long years, the requirements of this hive had steadily grown, so much so that the fallibility of flesh had only become more and more apparent. Muscle strain and age, reaction times slow, cognition decreases, and all meat, no matter how hot and red, will one day turn pallid, cold, and grey. Workers in their 30s are considered old by hive standards, many simply waiting for the onset of that inescapable fatigue, or of some inevitably crippling injury, sometimes caused by industrial accident, and sometimes just as a manifestation of a life spent in servitude to hard labor. But they could never cease in their work. The hive had its quotas, drafted by the higher-ups and cascaded down through the ranks to their overseers, who would not tolerate even a single inefficiency in the Goliath machine. Few things terrified the menials more than seeing their own hands shake, for they knew that the hive had solutions to such human problems. And if one could not work on the lines, then they could be used in some other way. They all knew someone who had been augmented. That was what they called it, simple augmentation, as if it were but an unintrusive improvement to the individual. But it was far more comprehensive than a simple augment. Labourers would be taken away when unable to work, only to return a short week later as a cybernetic thrall, a lobotomized slave to their superiors, entirely bereft of thought, yet focused unequivocally on completing their assigned tasks. Maybe it was better to die at one's post than to survive it as a mindless servitor. It might seem uncaring to force the workers to share a factory floor with their servitorized kin, but in actuality, it would be more uncaring to focus on anything but the allotted production quotas. Besides, where regular humans needed time to rest and recover, the servitors could be left indefinitely on shift. Their lack of independent thought truly a great boon to the entire hive. This bothered the workers to no end. They could not take pride in their human efforts when compared to the diligence of a sleepless machine. And rather, the servitors only seem to highlight the sloppy errors and mistakes which are inevitably born from simple fatigue. The servitors never feel a shred of pride nor accomplishment, yet the fact remains that even without these abstract motivations, they often accomplish their jobs just a fraction better, either by speed or precision, than of even the most skilled of human. The unmodified workers know they will one day slow, yet the servitor beside him will not. This breeds an almost existential anxiety. For how long can the lords justify their existence? And how long until all work is handed off to those tireless hands? What value can be found in decades of human skill, of soulful experience, when the Imperium can simply manufacture unquestionable obedience and tireless hands out of flesh and steel? Every worker knows, deep down in their bones, that the machine will outlast the man. They might take what pride they can in a well-forged bolt, or in a string of shifts performed without incident. But as they watch the servitors wordlessly toiling, they understand that their usefulness is merely a temporary condition. And on the day that their flesh falters, the inhuman engines of production will grind on without them. Far above the deafening factories, moving into the slightly cleaner and better-equipped tiers of the hive, another army of toilers will be found working just as ceaselessly. Deep in their endless vaults of parchment, illuminated by the screens of 1,000 cogitators, are to be the nameless clerks and scribes of the administratum. In their minds, they are the bureaucratic middle class, as of course treasured titles such as chronoglass counter, inventory auditor, and junior assistant to the overseer's attendant are naturally superior to the titleless dregs slaving away in the dank manufactoria. Their duties, too numerous to list in full, are to ensure that every resource within the hive was accounted for. So every milligram of iron, mote of fuel, every rivet, every segment of belt, and even the workers themselves, their rations, their small amenities, it all had to be counted and scrutinized. From their perspective, they had a far more comfortable existence than the workers they monitored. Sure, the clerk's hands might be stained with ink, but that is 1,000 times better than being stained with the tacky mire of oil. And sure, they didn't have access to fresh air, but the indoor atmosphere was certainly superior to whatever smog they breathed down in the factories. Despite these relative luxuries, many would find their lives to be just as soul-crushing as of the workers, and due to the nature of their work, would be unable to find the same humble pride of their labours. Bureaucracy on the scale of a hive world is truly behemothic and all-consuming. Every aspect of life is reduced to but a number. Every resource tally and quota is compared to the population levels, maintaining a steady equilibrium, sometimes deliberately reducing the available rations so as to quell a potential population boom. Each day, they transcribe their thousands of production reports, triple-checking and stamping page after page, updating every tithe ledger, verifying every count, never to be finished in their work, as more entries trickle in, like the grains of sand falling from an endless hourglass. Some clerks are known to collapse at their stations from exhaustion, but this matters not, for so long as they maintain the production quotas below, then all is to be well. But there can be no real room for misinterpreting their data. If a reading shows that a foundry has underperformed, then all excuses are null in the face of this failing, and someone must answer. They understand that the entire planet serves to fulfill only the looming requirements of the tithe, and that each year every report will be condensed and funneled down into a single document, determining whether or not the world has met its due or failed in its purpose. The perfect life for a scribe would be to go unnoticed from birth to death. If everything is fine, and if everything is documented, then there is no reason to even acknowledge their existence. But if they ever err in their duties, or if a metric is ever slightly off, then the scrutinous gaze of the administrative machine will peer down and render judgment as only a bureaucratic entity may. They will not be transfigured into a servitor. That would be barbaric. But inefficiencies cannot be permitted to fester within departmental zones, and so the identified clerk will simply be reassigned and sent off to a less desirable post. They will have no opportunity to defend their case, as they will be far too busy relocating to the other side of the hive, finding their new post a few levels closer to the unwashed workers below. Whereas before, they might have been reporting on the production quotas of bolts. Now, they are working in a clerical pool which handles the records of toxic waste disposal units. Though the clerk will never actually handle the waste and never actually handled a bolt in their old job, the discrepancy in the perceived prestige of what they inscribe upon parchment will effectively define their relative value, and in this case, will serve as a death sentence for their social life. They will need to relocate from their old hab, uprooting everything to be closer to their new duties, which are unfortunately found in the underhive. After all, efficiency is king, and so time cannot be wasted on a long commute from hab to sub-hab. The work won't have changed in any meaningful way, but even if they perform admirably in this new post, there will be zero chances of being promoted back to their old life. The administrative supervisors will state that they have properly utilized their clerk and place them in a more appropriate position. So why change what they have so confidently improved? The clerks responsible for monitoring the servitor levels in the factories are somewhat privileged in their knowledge that no scribes are ever transfigured, and that it is a punishment relegated only on the unskilled labourers below. They never have to worry that they will be transformed. The Imperium could not possibly throw their lives away, and maybe a relocation to a new job wouldn't be so bad. Of course, they do not realize that a reassignment may as well erase their identity, for they are only pushed downwards through the ranks, moved into a position which requires less thought and independence, as if that individual were in fact less of a human than of their peers. Stationed in their colossal central bastion, and across hundreds of sprawling outposts, we will find the soldiers of Varnaxis, almost living in a world apart from both worker and clerk. These are the men and women of the Imperial Guard, split between the reserves of the Planetary Defense Force and of the dignified members of the great regiments. To them falls the sacred duty of defending the hive world from threats both without and within. Clad in sturdy flak armor, they drill on parade grounds under gigantic Aquila statues, rightly seeing themselves as the sword and shield of the Emperor, among a crowd who would surely perish without their constant watch. There is a palpable sense of pride and superiority in their regiments. A guardsman on this world holds unquestionable value in his own eyes, as he has been chosen, trained, tested, and was found worthy to bear arms in the defense of humanity. Unlike the toiling masses, he is authorized to use lethal force, and is ostensibly trusted with the fate of an entire planet in the event of war. In keeping with such responsibilities, the soldiers receive increased rations and dwell within barracks quite superior to a common hab. Of course, this has all bred a measure of arrogance within the soldiery. Marching in step, repeating their disciplined orders, the guardsmen do tend to look down upon the civilian population they are sworn to protect. They view the workers as mindless drudges, and the clerks as weak pedants, neither of whom possess the steel and virtue that the Emperor's warriors require. Their dedication to the martial creed, with every hour spent on weapon drills, tactical simulations, inspections, and sermons on duty, it all sets them apart from the undisciplined rabble. Ironically, anyone on Varnaxis can aspire to enlist, as the regiments are indeed drawn from the same population the soldiers scorn. Many line troopers themselves grew up in the dank underhive, only to be transformed by training into stalwart imperial guardians. But once transformed, they often consider their old lives and neighbours as part of a lower, weaker category. The sharpness of their drill creates a dividing line and hammers in a single idea through the entirety of their military career: that there are guardsmen, and then there is everyone else. It is quite ironic that they will label civilians as fragile, while conveniently ignoring the truth that they themselves were born of this apparent fragility. Any sympathetic recruits will quickly have their views beaten out of them, as again, if they are to join the Guard, then they are to be warriors, and warriors need not concern themselves with those too dull to make the cut. Naturally, the Guard isolate themselves from the wider populace, subconsciously viewing the hive citizens as sheep to be herded and protected. The irony that any one of those sheep could enlist tomorrow and don the same uniform is lost amid the daily reinforcement of esprit de corps. In their mess halls, the troops bolster their sense of holding a special status with harsh jokes and fervent slogans. They swap stories, often exaggerated, of putting down underhive riots or catching renegade cults lurking in a sump. Tales which always seem to emphasize how dangerous the masses really are, and of how vital the Guard's firm hand is to keep order. The workers are portrayed as near feral brutes, just a step away from frenzy, and the clerks as feeble pen pushers who would crumble without armed oversight. More so than the wider populace, the Guardsmen hold a special disgust for the servitors who have come to plague the manufacturer. It is common to express open revulsion at the lobotomized machines, with soldiers sneering at the cyborgs assigned to logistical tasks, calling them all manner of expletives, which the servitor naturally cannot comprehend. Thankfully, no servitor will ever be permitted to assist the Guardsmen in anything beyond manual labor, and for their sacred duties, no Guardsman will ever be transfigured. Nevertheless, however confident they are in their superiority to a common worker, the Guardsmen harbor their own gnawing anxieties. Varnaxis has maintained its Guard regiments since its founding, yet it has not seen a significant war in recent memory. The local star sector is peaceful. Segmentum Pacificus, meanwhile, was named specifically because of its calmness. And while this is undoubtedly a good thing, it does call into question the necessity of such a large military presence. Remarkably, none of the officers, not even the senior generals, have ever taken part in a real battle. Their records show that at least 14 generations have passed since the last off-world campaign, and so while their recruitment posters all exemplify honor and glory, they secretly fear that when push comes to shove, that the regiments may be found wanting. They might never be called to serve, their training might all be for nothing. And if the Imperial Guard's entire ethos revolves around sacrifice and valor in defending mankind, then without a need for defense, what are they? If their value is truly predicated on a battle which no longer threatens them, then perhaps they are surplus to requirements. Conversely, if a war does come, then what if the Guard are too green to be effective? They might believe their drills to be useful, but what if they are lying to themselves? What if they finally get a chance to prove themselves in real combat, but fall short in the face of that test? What if they, too, are just as weak and cowardly as the citizens they view so disdainfully? If that was the case, then the solution would be simple. They would be replaced. The regiments, if unable to serve, would be dissolved by the administratum, and the world's defense would be entrusted to a real regiment, perhaps one such as the Death Corps of Krieg, who are known to never suffer from such foolish thoughts as self-worth. But there is no time to express their anxieties, as there are drills and training programs to busy themselves with, and none would dare admit to harboring such thoughts. For now, their boots need polishing, and their banners need raising. In their hearts, they know that they are indispensably useful. After all, they were selected to remain within the regiments, instead of being shipped off to some blasted armpit of the galaxy. And so, for the time being, they will be content with the knowledge that their honor and duty carries with them a weight which the lower classes could never imagine. The populace of Varnaxis, myriad and scattered as it were, could never be trusted to amble blindly into the dark. Despite the protection of the guard, even a safe hive may one day fall into ruin. But thankfully, under the enlightened guidance of the ecclesiarchy, those errant souls will ever be shielded from their own folly. Robed in ornate vestments, swinging censers of incense through the claustrophobic Hab corridors, the priests and preachers of the ecclesiarchy were to uphold the values of the imperial faith. Their ordained mission was simple. They were to spread the worship of the God-Emperor of mankind, to offer solace and moral guidance to the downtrodden, and to ensure that the populace remained entirely devout and unquestionably compliant. The work-weary masses often seek comfort in the Emperor's light, hoping for a blessing at the start of a grueling shift, to which the priests would gladly provide, after all. That was duty, and they had made much from sanctifying the labours of the lowly. But of course, they could not venture into the hive sprawl themselves. Oh no, that would be beneath them. Their place was in the towering cathedrals and monasteries of the upper hive, and it had always been more appropriate for the priests to keep themselves separate and to simply disperse their prayers through booming voxcasters. The lower classes never really questioned this arrangement, but it certainly favoured the priests. They could remain as distant as the Emperor himself, thereby isolating them from the regular turmoil of hive city living. It then only made sense for them to receive nigh unlimited rations and to dwell in the finest abodes. For how could one so closely associated with faith be expected to live beneath their means? Their opulence was further justified by the simple fact that a faithful worker is a good worker. The efforts of the clergy reduced the likelihoods of disruption within the workers, so the priests obviously extolled their sermons as playing a pivotal role in the world meeting its tithe quotas. Yet the relationship between the clergy and the other classes was complicated. The priests may preach of compassion, duty, and of the collective worth of all mankind, but they have specifically focused on the idea that hard labor is a necessary struggle for humanity. But to make matters worse, over time, they seem to have reinterpreted the imperial creed in such a way to justify cruelty when it is inflicted by those above. For instance, when the planetary governor's policies result in famine within the lower hive, the themes of purification through suffering are sung, assuring the starving masses that their pains are tests of faith, or perhaps punishments for their collective sin. None suspect this complicity of the priests with the harsh governance of the world, as of course the lower classes all hold the ecclesiarchy with extreme respect, even if it is never returned in kind. The preachers don't altogether mind the twisting of faith to serve their own needs. Some might feel a tinge of guilt, but really, most of them rationalize it under the guise of maintaining order. They ignore the hypocrisy of claiming the Emperor watches over all Imperials, while tacitly endorsing the idea that some humans, the poor, the lame, the malcontent, are simply lesser and can be condemned without contradiction. This has obviously enforced the rigid hierarchy of Varnaxis, where at the top we find the devout and the powerful, often one in the same, whose actions are beyond reproach, Yet below are the masses, whose duty is to obey and endure. And at the very bottom are those deemed irredeemable, who need not be shown mercy at all. This last category conveniently includes the servitors, who the priests view as existing outside of the concerns of faith. It is easy enough to brand every servitor as a criminal, undergoing a form of terminal punishment, with the remainders of their half-lives being lesser than of a regular human, and thus, since they are more akin to objects than of living beings, then they will possess no soul in need of salvation. No servitor could possibly pray for forgiveness, which only makes it more unnerving when a worker reports to his overseer that he heard one of those half-mechanical beings humming monotonously while a hymn played over the voxcasters. It's all rather tragic that one could be servitorized due to a complete accident and find the ecclesiarchy to promptly abandon them, as though their soul somehow became less worthy due to its proximity with a machine. Still, the priests know that their own position in hive society is rather cushioned. They enjoy privileges the average worker or even soldier could hardly dream of, all thanks to the necessary service they provide to mankind. But how necessary are they? How many of the priests ignore the cry of their flock? How many of them have resigned themselves to their comfortable lives, satisfied that the hive is obedient and too afraid to be misled? After all, some of them have to wonder about how useful faith can be on a world defined by its growing industry. Their sermons might hold the hive together, but perhaps it is more likely that they are merely tolerated as some cultural ornament, or that they are only retained because the high lords of terror demand it, and that maybe their faith does not resonate all that much with the hive dwellers. If an enemy fleet were in orbit, sure, it might be comforting to hear the words of a priest, but would carry very little weight compared to the orders of a commander and his marching armies. Thus, the gnawing fear is that one day their faith will be deemed as secondary to the survival of the hive, and, if decreed, their numbers might be thinned. But after a lifetime of being treated with reverence, none could possibly imagine themselves living as common workers. If the monasteries ever closed, then some of them might aspire towards advising the planetary governor, or joining with the retinue of some distant cardinal. Something, anything, that would keep them at the top of the social order. Yet such thoughts are meaningless. The imperium of man is united beneath the incandescent splendor of the God-Emperor. The monasteries would never close, for they stand to preach his word. None were as important as the priests. And really, were their fears at all related to themselves? Or were they more concerned that the masses may one day be misled to stray from their light and to find comfort in the faith of another? High above the squalor and clamour of the lower hives, up in palatial suites of marble and gilt, it would seem as though the struggles and squabbles of the world truly did not matter. This was the realm of the planetary governor and of the noble houses who busied themselves with the most important task of any world, ensuring that the tithe was met, and thus keeping themselves in good graces with the wider imperium. Together, they lived in truly unimaginable luxury, wielding power that a common human could scarcely comprehend. Every whim and desire is seen to by attentive servants, as they dine on delicacies imported from off-world pleasure gardens, while bathing in the purest waters of the Segmenta, peering out of armor-glass balconies at the rolling clouds, obscuring the dirty dishevelment of the hive below. They wait for nothing, save perhaps for the next shipment of vintage amasec to alleviate their ennui. It is quite amazing that not a single noble will have ever stepped foot within the lower or even middle hive layers. At most, they might visit an ecclesiastical monastery, but to be quite honest, they have no real reason to ever leave their palaces. And why would they? Everything of value to them is contained in the upper spires, and if something useful was to be found upon this world, it would be brought directly to their feet. To them, there are two categories of people upon Varnaxis. There are the fellow aristocrats, and then those whose worth is to be aggregated into population metrics. The rigid social delineation of the hive really doesn't matter in the slightest to the lords, and it seems those designations of worker, clerk, guardsman and priest all blur into insignificance at this altitude. They have no reason to bother themselves with the petty distinctions of the commoners, as at this level it simply wastes valuable hours that could be spent indulging in some new leisurely pastime. Their governance, therefore, is made up of a series of sweeping abstractions. Ruling over hundreds of billions of souls is no easy feat, yet their families were graced with the trust and authority to utilize their masses as they see fit, so long as their tithes are always met. The governor and his court will rely on endless layers of subordinates, many themselves high-born, to filter information upwards, with summaries of surveys reviewing analyses of prospective approximations and predictions, all condensing the complex lives of billions of souls into easily digestible statistics. Documents may read, Hab Cluster 31 production down 0.002% due to minor plague, countermeasures in place. Or population increase in hive sector Epsilon 4 predicted, reduce rations by 15% to curtail. The governor himself doesn't actually need to micromanage these events. He just needs to make sure they do not upset the comfortable equilibrium. Over their dinners, the lords will attempt to boost their own social standing by boasting of their careful stewardship of a hive district, with the governor casting a perfunctory nod before swiftly returning to a more engaging topic, perhaps a planned Xenos hunting expedition on a nearby moon, or an extended visit to a similarly opulent court. The truth is that for as long as the planetary tithe is met, then the nobility's interest in planetary affairs is mostly ritual, as it would be beneath them to fret over the minutiae of hive operations. Their kind know, with absolute certainty, that they are untouchable to the convulsions of the lower world. If the masses starve, they will still feast. If manufactorums burn, the nobles will simply import goods at a higher cost until rebuilding is complete. If war ever came to their world, they would retreat into their armored bunkers. Or hell, they might just travel off-world to be received as honored survivors, probably to be granted with new estates thanks to their opulent connections. Further, the High Lords of Terra hold a vested interest in the stability of the many worlds of the Imperium, and so will devote fathomless resources towards preserving the noble bloodlines of its trusted aristocrats. The hive workers could revolt en masse, only to be slaughtered in the billions and replaced by off-worlders, to which the imperial historians would record as only a temporary disturbance. But if the nobility were ever threatened, then the full weight of the Segmentum Armada would descend, just to prop them back up. Thus, they truly have nothing to fear. Life is, from their viewpoint, as good as it can be, as they live in a microcosm of imperial grandeur and stability. If somewhere far below 1 million people perish in an underhive purge, then the nobles won't even know it. They remain atop their spires, serene, aloof, and at peace. They have no reason to question as to whether or not tomorrow will be better or worse, as their days have always been gilded, and no matter what, will remain in gold. For thousands of years, Varnaxis had served the Imperium exactly as required. And so it was rather strange when a scribe upon Holy Terror noticed a slight discrepancy in their records. Administratum officials had determined that this world's shipments had been just a fraction below their predicted quota. This was in no way intentional, it simply couldn't be, and it seemed as though this was just a rounding error from the early days of the Imperium, which had simply been buried under millennia of bureaucratic busywork. Now this was a barely perceptible shortfall, perhaps a few hundred las guns missing from an order of 1 million, or a few tons of ore missing in 10,000. But over the thousands of years, that little discrepancy had added up into a sizable debt. Usually, governors are executed and replaced for such mistakes, but in this case, a rare gesture of leniency was granted. The nobles had always maintained an orderly world and had proven themselves as steadfastly loyal for millennia. So they were simply ordered to fulfill their prior obligations by increasing the yearly tithe by a measly 1%. The planetary governor, upon reading this message, hardly reacted, beyond a silent twinge of embarrassment that the sector lords had noticed the underperformance before he did. Certainly, he would have preferred to catch up on the tithe quietly and on his own terms. But no matter. A 1% tithe increase was nothing to fear. At his next assembly, he informed his council of the increase, all of whom calmly acknowledged. Really, why should any of them worry at all? A 1% increase? What's the worst that could happen? Unfortunately, however, down in the hive, this tiny, seemingly insignificant change brought with it total calamity. Varnaxis was a tightly wound mechanism that had been operating near maximum capacity already. Squeezing 1% more productivity out of 250 billion people was like tightening a vice on an overstrained beam, and something was bound to crack. The revised quotas ordered for every manufactorum to construct 1% more goods, every resource harvesting operation to uncover 1% more materials, every artificial agri-center to harvest 1% more food, and every conscription center to recruit 1% more of the populace. It sounded so minor, but how in the hell could the overseers increase their output when every shift was already full? The workforce, sadly, took the brunt of this change. Productivity had plateaued over the past few centuries, but of course there was always room for adjustment. The manufactoria already ran around the clock, and to extend the individual shifts would likely raise the rates of industrial accidents. Yet it was the obvious first solution. A larger workforce would compensate for this increased injury turnover rate. So the labour age was lowered by several years, with children now being allotted for preliminary service within the churning foundries of the underhive. The production levels ticked up by a marginal fraction, but it wasn't quite 1%. The human workforce, try as they might, simply could not will itself to be more productive than it already had been. Fatigue, injuries, and general errors increased far more rapidly than expected. Some manufactoria even saw their levels drop due to the change. This could not be permitted, and so, given that this involved the realm of the machine, a delegation of the Adeptus Mechanicus was summoned for their cold yet expert opinion. The technophants of Mars, who, unsurprisingly, favoured the certainty of steel over the weaknesses of flesh, evaluated the hive's operations and offered a blunt solution. They needed more servitors. They pointed out how, on their forge worlds, menial labour was performed almost entirely by those lobotomized cyborgs, and that the hive's reliance on a human workforce seemed quaint yet entirely antiquated. The governor acquiesced. After all, the Martians only suggested for a minor increase in servitor levels, and seeing these figures on paper up in his palace, he did not have to consider the human cost of his next decree. The Mechanicus agents were permitted to take charge of servitorization for the next solar year, and though the hive usually selected criminals and deviants for transformation, the Martians held no such views, and so cast a far wider net. At first, those who were minorly injured were picked up. Then the criteria loosened, and batches of healthy workers were summoned to the conversion camps. Eventually, it devolved to simply meeting a number. Billions were selected. Billions of workers, once loyal servants to the hive, were lobotomized and transformed into mindless servitors before being marched into their workplaces, locked into place, and set to work for the foreseeable future. With this influx of servitors, the production lines ran far smoother, though were notably quiet. The tech priests, who had almost entirely supplanted the old overseers, communicated mostly in binary to the servitors, which only confused the remaining human workers, who, falling behind the expected levels, were soon to be branded as inefficient and marked for future servitorization. Quite interestingly, as servitors filled more roles on the factory floors, the administrative burden of coordinating them actually decreased. Servitors don't require payment, complex shift scheduling, and subsist on only a thin gruel of corpse starch slurry to fuel their ragged biological remains, whilst their cybernetic components are powered by crude charging clamps. As such, a single tech adept with a cogitator can manage hundreds of them in unison, and so, before long, the human clerical apparatus in those factories became almost entirely redundant. The hive simply found that the bureaucratic class of administrators had been made obsolete. As such, it was downsized, with roles and departments consolidated into semi-automated systems, which required very little human oversight. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands, then millions of mid-level clerical staff received transfer orders or were outright released from their positions. They had been purged, but the Imperium does not simply let go of a valuable human resource. So most of these clerks were reassigned to the only sector with a limitless appetite for labor, the manufactorum floor. It was quite a shock for the former clerks, who just a week ago might have been reviewing shift reports, then the next to be carrying heavy components alongside the very people whose names he used to redline for errors. They always thought themselves as safe, but to be told that their minds were no longer required was a humiliation beyond reckoning. The downward spiral of reclassification did not stop with the clerks, as the planetary leadership, seeing how the Mechanicus interventions had yielded a spike in output, now looked to the proud regiments of the Imperial Guard. It was true that the Hive had been peaceful for ages, and that millions of Guardsmen stood ready, but were arguably idle. Thus, the governor's new advisers stepped forward and made a ruthless calculation that if labor was needed to meet their new quotas, then why not draw from those who, at the moment, were not deployed upon a battlefield? The notion would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. But the times were not normal, and the danger of missing a tithe payment eclipsed such superfluous notions of honor or pride. The order was thusly dispatched for 10% of the planet's guardsmen to be immediately stripped of rank and reassigned to the Hive's labor forces. To avoid playing favorites and to curtail the risk of corruption, this selection was done at random. Their ranks were weighted to avoid the destruction of entire units or roles, but the decimation was as fair and indiscriminate as it could be. In one stroke, millions of guardsmen were informed that their service had ended, that they were to turn in their lasguns, remove their regimental patches, and report to the Underhive for menial assignments. The reaction was obviously one of shock and initially outrage. They prided themselves on honor, and to be discharged without cause was the gravest of all possible insults. But denial was unthinkable. It was their duty to obey. The unlucky 10% had no choice but to comply. This massed emotion could have led to a widespread resentment among the remaining guardsmen, a most dangerous prospect indeed. But, strangely, the unaffected 90% quickly devised a rationale to justify what had happened. They started a rumor that the selection hadn't really been random. Sure, they were all told it was random, but there was no way the Administratum would throw away truly loyal soldiers at random. The 10% must have been pre-chosen for their deficiencies, maybe for some acts of cowardice, or for simply being less effective during their training programs. This, of course, was an entirely farcical myth, cooked up to settle the discomforting thought that they could have just as easily been demoted for no reason at all. Their self-deception ran so deep that within months the majority of the guardsmen disdainfully struck the records of their old compatriots from the memorial books, claiming that those 10% got what they deserved, and that the demotions were a good thing, which had only strengthened the honor of the remaining guard. As these drastic measures unfolded, the Mechanicus advisors slowly increased their presence, bringing in new cohorts of tech priests to oversee further aspects of the Hive's governance. With them came their own austere and materialist philosophy, And since they most often dwelled within the manufactoria, the wider population of the hive soon began to hear far more about the cult mechanicus than of the imperial creed. The common citizens couldn't help but notice that the ecclesiarchal prayers had ceased playing over the vox, and wondered where the priests were in their hour of spiritual need. Some of them wondered if they too had been relegated to the workforce and now silently laboured beside them. But that was a preposterous thought. The imperial cult still existed upon this world, but in this time of crisis, the hive authorities did not want the masses to be gathering within cathedrals when they could be working, or recovering to work again. Besides, the new Mechanicus overseers had their own way of working, which did not involve the usual time of prayer. And since the governor had passed off more and more control over the hive to his Martian advisors, the priests soon found themselves as being less than needed. In blunt terms, they were no longer required, at least not in their old numbers. But removing the clergy from an imperial world is rather a delicate matter. The ecclesiarchy holds immense power of its own, and the ministorum could declare this as an act of heresy, warranting a punitive war of faith, where the vengeful sisters of battle would cleanse the sinners of this world in an ocean of holy flame. So instead of inciting their rage, a more delicate path was chosen. The clergymen and priests were quietly transferred off-world to a number of shrine worlds and ecclesiarchal holdings in the wider segmentum, under the guise that they were simply needed more elsewhere. To smooth things over, a hefty donation was also provided to the ministorum leaders, which itself was fished out of the pooled resources intended to go to the future tithe. But it was perfect. The priests were removed without facing the ugliness of defrocking them, and it allowed them to continue in their vocation without interfering with the new operations of the hive. Very few of them denied their new transfers, as they had it framed as some higher calling, that their talents were needed on such and such shrine world to tend to a holy pilgrimage, which was far more flattering of a task than lazily rereading old prayers into a crude voxcaster. The scant priests who remained were to watch over their old monasteries, and once again adjusted their sermons to match the new struggles of the hive, this time preaching of how it is in fact a privilege to suffer through such hard times, and of how it is better to die for the emperor than to live for yourself. They would recite these messages while retaining their old material comforts, as no one came to seize their private cathedrals, nor to forbid their Candlemas feasts. But the common folk experienced the absence of the ecclesiarchy's advocacy exactly when they needed it most. The shepherds had effectively left the flock to the wolves, a fact not lost on many workers, who now saw their former preachers whisked away to greener pastures. And so, in a remarkably short span, the entire social structure of Varnaxis was violently shaken and rearranged. The statistics were truly staggering. It was just a 1% adjustment to the tithe, but billions of human lives had been abruptly reclassified, with entire age groups of children vanishing into the workforce, a significant portion of the population mutilated into cybernetic servitors, the clerical classes dissolved, proud guardsmen stripped of their rank, and priests forced away through baseless promise. Those still in their original roles might have been spared, but even they were pushed to new extremes. The manufactoria burned hotter, with the old workers having to pick up the slack from the new clerks, inefficient and woefully incompetent. Both groups mixed into one pot, with each just as likely to be plucked out and transfigured into a servitor. The remaining soldiers doubled down on their disdain for the lower classes, but now they were fewer in number, and the commoners seemed oh so bitter at the societal change. But what of the nobility in all this upheaval? The truth of it is that they emerged entirely unscathed. They read the reports, scant as ever, though now marked with Mechanicus symbols next to imperial aquillas, that there had been a slight rise in planet-wide discontent, a marginal increase in servitorization, but that most importantly, production levels had increased by 1%. Everything else was meaningless. The governor didn't even read the rest of the report. He saw exactly what he needed, and now it was time to celebrate. His feasting table was just as full as ever, the extended families of the nobility all safe and fed, and truly, life was just as gilded as ever. Some might have called this a crisis. Not him. Crises only occur when men are unguided. But the nobility had guided this world for generations, and had never ceased in their leadership, not even during the insignificance of a simple readjustment to their tithe. As the year drew to its close, the tithe ships came, collected their lot, and departed. The administratum noted that the proper allocation of resources had been met and moved on to the next world and the next beyond. No one would ever really know what had transpired upon the hive. Beneath that thin veneer of normalcy lay the scars of an entire generation who knew nothing but heightened toil and fear. Yet none of them could do anything about it. From the perspective of the Imperium's masters, the tithe recalibration was so uninteresting that it required scarcely a footnote in their planetary records. Why bother listing the societal convulsions behind that improved output? Why waste time mentioning how the Imperial Guard of that world seemed strangely adversarial to their own kinsmen? And was it really all that important to make note of how the Mechanicus had been called as advisors, only to orchestrate the servitorization of several billion Imperial citizens, all while silently ejecting the priesthood? No, none of that towered over the single most important fact, that the tithe was met, and that the great rusted war machine of the Imperium of Man could trundle on for another day. Some scholars, perhaps those of a more philosophical nature, might feel as though the Imperium hates the humans it rules. After all, there are countless tales of innocents being condemned to death via exterminatus, or of worlds being mistreated and burned under false denunciations. But in actuality, the Imperium is entirely indifferent to its myriad citizens. We cannot comprehend the human population of the galaxy, but the Lords have decreed that if a minor portion is to be sacrificed, then it is because their sacrifice is necessary for the survival of the wider Imperium. They are responsible for the fates of a galaxy-spanning species, and so, what is one world's temporary anguish weighed against the imperatives of an age where there is only war. But with this, my dearest friends, I do believe that we have now come to our end. Thank you all so much for listening to this story on the dark fates of those who dwell within the Imperium of Man. And I do hope you enjoyed a tale slightly bereft of bolters and bloody battles. Nevertheless, I must now depart and leave this as the first project of our year. But before I go, know that I greatly appreciate your time and that I shall wish each and every one of you with a very warm goodbye.